Scholars have argued that without humanism, the Reformation could not have succeeded, and it is certainly difficult to imagine the Reformation occurring without the knowledge of languages, the critical handling of sources, the satirical attacks on clerics and scholastics, and the new national feeling that a generation of humanists provided. Historian Stephen Osment. This is what you get when you found a political system on the family values of Henry VIII. At a point in the not too remote future, the stout heart of Queen Elizabeth II will cease to beat. At that precise moment, her firstborn son will become head of state, head of the armed forces, and head of the Church of England. Contrarian polemicist Christopher Hitchens. People debate what exactly ended the Middle Ages and ushered in the modern era, with answers ranging from the sack of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453 to the cultural flourishing of the early 16th century in Western Europe, known as the Renaissance. Most, however, would be hard-pressed to refute that the Reformation, particularly of Martin Luther, and Henry VIII's break with Rome, irrevocably changed the political landscape and spiritual lives of Christians in the West. Where Luther laid out an alternative doctrine that was to capture the hearts and minds of a German population already resentful of the Catholic Church, Henry of England cast aside the papacy for much more personal reasons and implemented change from above. Luther wasn't the first person to rail against the Church and promote a new theology. He had predecessors in John Wycliffe of England, who rose to prominence around the time of the Peasants' Revolt, and Jan Hus of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, whose movement was, after a century of violence, begrudgingly officially recognized by the Pope. Both men prefigured Luther in that they were university lecturers who advocated a return to the Word of God, condemned the institution of the Church, and considered certain popular practices in Catholic doctrine to be erroneous. Wycliffe is famous for being the first to translate the Bible from Latin into English, and Luther followed him in translating the Bible into High German, which has served as the basis for the modern language as we know it. He aimed to write in a dialect that would be understood by most German speakers. The precise circumstances of Martin Luther's fallout with the Catholic Church concerned Albert of Brandenburg, the Archbishop of Mainz, who was conspiring with Pope Leo X in a massive indulgence drive in order to pay for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Luther viewed the selling of indulgences, where people paid to have their time in purgatory, a kind of halfway house between earth and heaven where souls did penance for their sins, reduced, as a corrupt practice fueled by misguided popular belief. He sent a letter to Albert, known as the 95 Theses, outlining his arguments on the 31st of October, 1517. It was soon made into a pamphlet, and Luther's ideas spread quickly throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, via the new technology of the printing press. Luther placed great emphasis on the Word of God, i.e. the Bible, and held the preaching of the gospel to be the most important element of communal worship. This was in opposition to the tradition of the Catholic Church, with the inherited authority of the papacy. Fundamental to Luther's theology was the idea of grace, which was to him the immense and undeserved gift of salvation granted to the elect, those who believed in God's mercy. Catholics, by contrast, believed good works could bring about their salvation, and that their sins could be absolved by confessing them to a divinely ordained priest. Unlike some of Protestantism's radical variants, some ornament survives in Lutheran churches. Organ music and hymns were still acceptable forms of worship, which reached their zenith in the religious music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Protestantism came to be accepted by a select group of many princes of the Holy Roman Empire after Luther specifically addressed the aristocracy in his 1520 pamphlet An die christlichen Adel deutscher Nation. He stressed that Christians should obey their secular overlords, as they were divinely ordained to maintain order. Later in the 1500s, Christian III of Denmark-Norway and Gustavus Vasa of Sweden converted to Lutheranism and forced the change on a largely indifferent population. Followers of Zwingli, a contemporary Swiss Protestant reformer, adopted the change more democratically in the city communes of Switzerland and southern Germany. Henry VIII was definitely a reformation from above, and was sparked by his attempt to annul the marriage between him and the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's Lord Chancellor, the equivalent of Prime Minister today, tried to persuade Pope Clement VII to no avail, and was fired, arrested, and charged with treason. Thomas Cromwell, his successor, implemented the king's wishes, and Henry was declared the supreme head on earth of the Church of England in 1534. Henry's Reformation had much in common with developments on the continent. The Church of England renounced Latin, clergy were allowed to marry, and monasteries were dissolved. A major difference, though, was that bishops and the administrative structure of Catholicism were retained. The wealth of the monks was taken into the royal coffers and redistributed among Henry's supporters. Henry VIII was succeeded by the 9-year-old Edward VI, during whose brief reign the Book of Common Prayer was published as a guide to worship in the Church of England. Following his premature death at the age of 15, his cousin was pushed off the throne by Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary, known as Bloody Mary, who reinstated Catholicism and had many Protestants imprisoned or burnt at the stake. Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, succeeded her and consolidated Henry's Reformation. She promised not to make windows into men's souls, i.e., not inquire closely as to personal belief, but people had to be nominal members of the Church of England, and church attendance was made mandatory.